Hi, I'm Francesca Maxime, and this is Wise Girl for June 14th, a beautiful Thursday. And I'm here with a special guest, Dr. Joseph Joe Loizzo. He is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and Columbia-trained Buddhist scholar with over 40 years of experience studying the beneficial effects of contemplative practices on healing, learning, and development. He is assistant professor of clinical psychiatry and integrative medicine at Weill Cornell Medical College, where he researches and teaches contemplative self-healing and optimal health. And he's also taught the philosophy of science and religion, the scientific study of contemplative states, and the Indo-Tibetan mind and health sciences at Columbia University, where he's an adjunct assistant professor at the Columbia Center for Buddhist Studies. And he also has two amazing books. One is Contemplative Psychotherapy, which is more of a collection, which is the latest one that you actually may want to start with a little bit, perhaps, because it's just a little bit easier to chunk down. And then this larger one, Sustainable Happiness, which really cuts to the core of why any of this is going on and why we care and why we're even doing this. Not only just this sort of ephemeral, fleeting happiness that we're going after, but how to cultivate that inner wisdom, the wise girl or wise guy in you, and how to sustain it. How can we actually keep it going? So, Joe, thanks so much for joining me today on Wise Girl. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Francesca, and I've enjoyed our conversation over the years, and I'm happy to be part of your reaching out to the world and sharing what you've learned.
Yeah, I think that, folks like you really bring something unique because you have the psychoanalytic perspective, you have the medical perspective, you have the actual practice, you're friends with the Dalai Lama, you do a lot of research, but clinical practice. So you see people living their real lives. And I would like to invite you to talk to me about how you see folks now beginning to integrate what otherwise seemed like different and disparate things, whether it's quantum physics, spirituality, and the philosophy of non-duality, mindfulness practices day to day, and then things like talk therapy or somatic psychotherapies.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and before I do that, my graphics team and my own team at Nalanda will definitely get on my case if I don't mention that I'm also the founder and director of Nalanda Institute for Contemplative Science.
Of course.
Which is where you and I have met in some of our classes on contemplative learning and transformation.
Absolutely. And I will also say that I apologize for that. Of course, Joe is the founder of Nalanda, which has a wonderful 4-year program and also many other retreats and offerings here, working in partnership with Tibet House here in New York City in many cases, and who just had an amazing benefit last week where they honored Dr. Stephen Porges with polyvagal theory, is someone that I also hope to introduce to the Wise Girl audience in another few weeks or so, also on another episode. And so, of course, this Nalanda Institute harkens back to something that actually is an ancient institute, which you may want to mention to start in terms of that integration, because it really parallels what I had asked you initially anyway.
Yes, great. Nicely done. So, yes, I think that the integrating different practices, different disciplines that have been siloed off in our modern analytic learning and science tradition is essential for all of us as human beings. Like, we're not split into 37 fragments, hopefully. We're just one person. And if the purpose of our learning, science, research, methodology, technology is to make us healthier, happier, wiser, more compassionate, more altruistic people, then all that learning needs to be funneled into our real processor, which is our mind-body system. And unfortunately, one of the things that's happened in the rediscovery of ancient science in the Renaissance was that knowledge was compartmentalized. And part of that had to do with the war between science and religion, where the soft internal human sciences were sort of, owned by the church. And on the other hand, the sciences, the new modern sciences of physics and chemistry and so on, and biology and so forth, were really set up on another platform that was sort of very objectivist and divorced from the inner life experience and more focused on breaking things down into pieces and looking at everything as objects. And of course, that's done amazing things for our understanding and mastery of the natural world. but I'm not sure how much it's done for our understanding of ourselves and how all of that knowledge and technology relates to our internal quality of life or capacity to make the most of our human life. So if you want to think about it as the humanist project, so there's two basic paradigms of knowledge in the West. The one is the sort of analytic scientific module. Francis Bacon described it as a bunch of little worker bees in their little cells gathering little bits of knowledge, and no one bee, maybe except the queen, I don't know, would be able to kind of pull it all together, but somehow it would all build toward a hive of something. And then the other model more comes out of the Renaissance, the Leonardo da Vinci and so on, and and Ficino and his academy in Milan, I believe it was, where it's all about humanism, and the man or human being is the measure of knowledge, and all knowledge, art, science, and so on needs to feed the quality of human life. So those two projects have been split off in our culture. And so, increasingly our modern culture reflects this fragmenting, technical, objectivist strain that's broken everything into bits. We have so much knowledge, we don't know what to do with it. And then there've been some hold-ons or holdouts of the kind of what has come to be thought of as perhaps more romantic or humanist tradition. Maybe it's somewhat relevant and somewhat involved in liberal arts, but that really is trying to help us figure out, well, what does this all mean for me? Now, bring us to the present. Psychotherapy is one of the few elements of our culture that is specifically designed in a way to bridge those two knowledge realms or experiential realms, and to help take the knowledge of the science. Freud developed psychotherapy as a kind of psychological or experiential window onto the neurosciences, and to really kind of helping people understand how the modern biological study of human evolution and the neuroscientific or physiochemical study of the brain and how it works, how's that really relevant to my understanding of myself? That's one big picture way to think about Freud's project. But from the other side, at the core of his methodology was one person working with one other person and helping that other person understand their own experience. So it was really a kind of, as a methodology, psychotherapy is really a N equals 2 kind of inside out or intersubjective process of assimilating knowledge in a way that's relevant to my own personal self-understanding, self-mastery, well-being. So that's in that sense, psychotherapy is one of the few institutions in the modern scientific or medical realm that still holds out that project of integrating science in a way that's relevant for human life, for individual life. Now, enter Buddhism and yoga and the Indic sciences from the West, from the East. So the Indic sciences, there's a reason why, of course, here we are in New York City with a yoga studio on every corner and a meditation studio sprouting up on every corner. And why everybody's practicing mindfulness, and mindfulness is all the rage, it is in part, we're benefiting from something unique that happened in India that did not happen in the West, right? So, of course, in India, as in the ancient West, there was this sort of balance between the humanistic sciences, the human sciences, and the physical or mathematical or technical arts and sciences. In India, that was true too, but the Indians actually kind of went in the opposite direction from the West. Western science, really from way back, was very interested in physics and very interested in understanding nature. And Pythagoras and others tried to figure out what was the fundamental nature of things. And the sort of internal side of philosophy and spirituality was there, but more kind of eventually brought into religion rather than dovetailing with science. the in India, there was a commitment early on, way back in the Buddhist age, around the time of Socrates, that actually the most important thing to understand was ourselves. And not only was it important to understand ourselves, but that the civilization really should and began to commit its main kind of knowledge drive and its main technical expertise to helping people not only understand, but live better within their own nervous system, their own mind and body, and become more integrated people who were able to enjoy a civilized life. Right. So while that project is kind of like,
no, I'm just going to repeat that because you're just starting to freeze up. And so I just want to repeat what you just said, is that you're saying that folks wanted to be more integrated with their nervous system and their mind and body. But right now you're frozen on the screen. So. Still frozen and can't really hear you.
In the
Still frozen. Still frozen and can't really hear you. As you were saying with the and you dropped out. Okay, so we're gonna have to either. There we are. You're back.
That better? Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah. Okay, so we're just going to pick up where you left off, which is basically, right, we're talking about the integration of people, the nervous system. You were saying that the most important thing was to understand ourselves, basically.
Right. And the thing about ancient India made that their main project. Rather than understanding nature, India really, I think partly because it was the wealthiest and most geopolitically secure of the ancient civilizations, India really decided that learning to help people enjoy life and be integrated and creative was their most important project. Whereas the West, because it was a poorer, more unstable, and in a way violent world, focused on trying to control the outer environment and bring a sense of mastery to nature. So India developed really made this commitment to give everybody the skills of contemplative self-awareness and self-mastery that were preserved for the elite in the West, whether it's monastic or whatever elite. And so that's why over time in the Buddha's age, yoga, Patanjali's basic system of yoga and his approach to mindfulness and self-awareness were codified really as things that everyone should know and needs to know. And Nalanda University, what you mentioned, was a kind of move to mainstream that basic science and technology of self-awareness and integration, the human sciences, into all the other disciplines, and to integrate it with medicine, politics, technology, and so forth. And that's why we feel that's what needs to happen now, as we in the West are in this we've done the natural world project and improved the basic external conditions of living for so much of humanity, given our focus on science and technology. But we can't enjoy it. We're neurotic. We're stressed. We're traumatized. Our main problems now are social, emotional, destructive emotions and misperceptions and prejudice that really have nothing to do with the physical world. They have to do with the way our minds are educated, cultivated. And so we really have this huge need for the inner sciences, the human sciences that help our minds and nervous systems catch up with the world we've created through science and technology.
And I love, yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I love that because I was, sort of starting to think recently, it's like, it's actually sort of not optional at a certain point, right? Like when we become, it's like, I was thinking about what's an analog for this? And I'm like, maybe like brushing your teeth, right? So you have toothpaste and you have a toothbrush, you're gifted with that. You don't have to use a root or something like they used to use, like you actually have this. And so you opt in and you do that once or twice a day or 3 or 4 times a day if you're really obsessive about it. And then you make sure that you maintain your well-being for going forward. And in that way, this is sort of the internal deplaquing or the internal decalcification, I think that is so needed. But because just like sound, it's not visible, right? Doesn't mean it's not there, and
Right.
doesn't affect us.
Right. Right. I really think that, and you started off with the issue or the question of why are we trying to integrate so many different knowledge spheres and practice spheres in the the healing disciplines and the spiritual disciplines in the West. And I think so. I was trying to give the backstory for the fact that that's actually just necessary. Any tradition that's tried to work with human internal development, psychological healing, integration, has had to translate a clearer understanding of the external world, of the nature of life, the nature of evolution, into language that a human being can really experience and understand. And that requires the integration of multiple disciplines, even though that runs counter to the modern scientific project of breaking everything down into bits so you can control and understand it better. This is really more about putting it all back together again so that you can live in the world that you've created. You can live well with others, as Aristotle said. And that's especially ramped up or amplified this integration because Freud believed it was necessary. He tried to make a claim for a multidisciplinary science of human mind and nature, but it's still his voice, and the voice of psychotherapy is still very quiet and marginal and maybe even endangered in the West. So it's wonderful that East and West have come together in this global age, because the Eastern traditions, which much more preserve this understanding of that the most important science and technology was the one that actually improved our internal ability to live in our own minds and nervous systems and to live with others in peace and understanding. Now those traditions have come into dialogue with Western traditions. So I think that they're really beefing up our ability to do the integration that's really necessary now, because we have created this unprecedented degree of safety and comfort, and we have these huge opportunities, but it's being squandered mainly because of our emotional, psychological, and mind-body lack of integration and lack of development.
Joe, you've mentioned Freud a couple of times, and obviously, the sort of foundational father of talk therapy and psychoanalysis, and then also you've mentioned the nervous system a couple of times, and the approaches of the sort of conversational resonance and witnessing, and more of one's experience could be in talk therapy in the Western world. Is now opening up to more of these somatic nervous system oriented approaches, which you are obviously very much aware of for honoring Dr. Stephen Porges of polyvagal theory, who talks about the social engagement system and safety and whether or not we feel safe and how we see cues, which is, like I was saying earlier, why I like to do these on video as well, because I can see that you're connecting with me or not, maybe, and then we can retune and do our little attachment rupture and repair that we would talk about if you were looking at John Bowlby's work. So, and et al.
Yeah. So I'm going to approach this from a Buddhist standpoint rather than a Western standpoint. So in Buddhism, we slowly, began with the techniques of mindfulness that are designed to cool the mind and kind of calm the nervous system and give people an ability to be at peace in their own minds and bodies in the present moment, right? But, when you sort of then start to bring that to people living everyday life, with all the social, emotional challenges of getting along with people, working together, integrating difference and so on, compassion becomes incredibly important. So the next wave of the Buddhist project was really to try to integrate the basic science of mind with the understanding of the heart, the importance of compassion, cultivating the capacity for warmth and connection. And then I like to say that there's a third wave, which is related to what are called the tantras, or esoteric practices, that are really about bringing that into the dialogue with the human body and the nervous system. So I often say that contemplative science in India began in the ashram or the vihara, the monastery, gradually moved into the household and the marketplace and the mainstream. That's what Nalanda represents, the university, the universalization of science and contemplation in Indian culture. And then eventually it went from the household and the marketplace into the human body and the nervous system. And that's what the tantras, or the most esoteric form of embodied contemplative practice in India, is all about. So what that really maps for us is already a very ancient traditional framework that integrates many different forms of contemplative practice that actually are represented by different traditions on our planet now. The mindfulness tradition from Sri Lanka and Burma and Thailand, the compassion tradition from East Asia, for example, from the Zen tradition, and then the embodied practices or esoteric practices from Tibet, Nepal, Ladakh, and so on, Mongolia. So these are all coming together in our age, but there is a traditional system, namely the Tibetan preservation of the Nalanda tradition, which maps these all out as part of one human developmental spectrum. And the idea is that you can't just speak to the mind, you can't just speak to the heart, and you can't just speak to the body, because we have all of those things, we have all those aspects, every one of us. So the sort of ultimate technology, if you will, for human evolution, healing, integration, is to bring the elements, to bring the science of understanding the mind and awareness, to bring and to kind of then move or integrate that with warming the heart, opening the heart, overcoming biases and reactivities, and finally to really tap into the deepest levels of the nervous system, which are connected to the oldest and subtlest parts of our brain, which Stephen Porges talks about vis-a-vis the autonomic nervous system. So that's a very ancient model, and actually really in modern psychotherapy, Freud developed talking therapy, but there were many other of his disciples and colleagues who developed techniques that were more heart-based and some of them more embodied-based, like Jung's use of imagery, for example, can really be seen as relating to this whole use of the facial expressions and the need to give safety cues through facial expressions. And then, of course, Reich's work with energy in the body, disarming the character armor that he believed blocked our nervous system and our capacity to experience well-being. This understanding of the multi-layered nature of human development, or the psyche or the nervous system, was present in Freud's day, but the more sort of embodied approaches and even the more heart-based approaches were seen as controversial, right? So science wasn't really ready to integrate these because the science didn't exist for us to understand the importance of emotion or to understand the importance of the mind-body system and the autonomic system. Those things have only come up, science has only caught up with the human sciences, right? Objective science, the science of the brain, has only caught up with the human sciences in recent decades. And so with the whole advent of effective neuroscience and the importance of positive psychology, understanding emotions and relationships, which relates to the attachment theory and Bowlby and all of those folks, new forms of therapy based on understanding interpersonal connection or intersubjective connection. And now, most recently, science is finally beginning to plug in an understanding of how the older part of the brain, the reptilian brain or the core brain, factors in terms of the basic regulation of safety versus stress, the basic regulation of awareness, whether it's deep open awareness or it's a fragmented analytical awareness. So this, the ancient traditions are really very interestingly all set, all ready to help integrate with the new neuroscience that's developing in the last few decades, to give us methods for tapping into those older parts of the nervous system where most of our problems lie, actually. Really, the most serious and intractable human problems, whether it's social, or, intimate relationship challenges, or it's trauma and embodied stress challenges. The ancient traditions, science has just discovered them, but the ancient traditions have been onto this for millennia and are very well prepared with tools
Right.
to help us deliver on the promise that science is really introducing.
Well, now that we have fMRIs and Mathieu Ricard and Richie Davison and all those folks doing this kind of research, we can create studies and people can see and recognize, that there's actually brain changes and growth in the prefrontal cortex or in the thickening of the, areas and how the corpus callosum can integrate different parts of the brain and how we're all this, and we talk about this triune brain, but really it's a complex network and systems. But basically you're growing parts that are helpful to making the Homo sapiens sapien part of us, the one who is aware that we're aware of the fact that we also have programming and conditioning and reactivity that we can, as the buzzword was a couple years ago with Airbnb and Uber, disrupt our default mode network, right?
Yeah.
We can disrupt that. And so what you're saying is that all of this these ancient wisdom traditions have already laid out the roadmap. There's already a template, and now we can weave this in. And what I like to do is call it applied mindfulness, meaning how do I apply it to my life and my relationships, but how does it then influence the way in which we show up in the world when it comes to things like racism or the planet or other things? Because I feel like there's a lot of folks who try to jump ahead into the compassion and then they burn out because they haven't figured out how to regulate their own individual nervous system and stay steady before they do that. So can you speak to a little bit about how this helps when you actually pay attention to your own internal experience and how that helps you show up in personal relationships and then in other larger ways down the line?
Sure. Well, I think that in terms of the brain, I like the triune brain model, even as you point out, it is considered now archaic in a way because we understand the complexity of neural networks, but still there is an evolutionary hierarchy to how those networks evolve. And I see the work to be done as, if you start, for most people, starting at the newer part of the brain, the neocortex, including the prefrontal cortex, and each of these parts of, and then moving on to the emotional brain, which is in the limbic system primarily, or in those structures surrounding the limbic system. And then eventually really getting to the core brain, the reptilian brain, where we really are dealing with fundamental stress and fundamental quality of consciousness. But this is such a journey that we have to start where most of us find it easiest. Well, some people find it easiest to go from the top down. Other people find it more easy to go from the bottom up. So that's maybe where the ancient traditions, again, have sort of anticipated what we're learning now. And at each of these levels, I like Dan Siegel's language in this very much, that there are integrative systems or networks that help us establish a sense of feeling safe and connected and prepared to socially engage with others. That's particular Porges idea, but the idea of social engagement. But the idea is that our whole brain has multiple networks that are either there to keep us vigilant and defensive, or are there to help us calm down and connect and be open and play or create with others. And so at each level, we're trying to shift the balance from the stress reactive systems to the more integrative systems. And the practices of things like mindfulness or compassion practice or embodied practice help that mission at deeper and deeper levels of the nervous system. So in the beginning, what we're really looking at is trying to, as you pointed out, the default mode network, which is really about, mostly in the neocortex, is really about kind of a slightly wary or negatively biased autopilot, which is really saying, I don't know what's happening right now, but I better stay hypervigilant because something bad might happen.
Yeah, the tiger might jump out of the bush or something. And
yes, and mindfulness helps to deregulate that, helps to disrupt that, and as a result, make us give us greater access to the present awareness part of our neocortex that is the most sociable, the part that allows us to be most empathic, creative, to engage in cultural roles and activities, connecting with others on the largest scale. At the next level, the issue really relates to traumatic reactivity and the amygdala hijack. And that's what happens when, under the radar, we feel we're not safe with others. And it triggers childhood emotional responses that actually put us into a fight or flight mode. And that's really best dealt with using wise compassion training or compassionate mind training. There's some practices like self-compassion that have really helped us with this, to help us really understand that at the bottom of all social stress is our own memory of being a helpless, powerless child. And if we can learn how to put our own oxygen mask on and soothe that inner child so that it feels safe and connected, then we can engage the more progressive or pro-social part of our limbic brain, which is the heartfelt openness, warm connection, compassion. And we know now that simple practices like loving kindness, self-compassion, or more advanced Tibetan compassion training practices can help us really to build those muscles that positive psychology and effective neuroscience tell us are really the best tools for our life, reconciling difficult relationships, whether it's in home or at work or whatever. The final project where we deal with embodied practices relates to the kind of the extreme primitive, the most older part of our common nervous system, the primitive vagal nervous system, which is really about a faint freeze system, and is really there when we feel very imminently threatened by something, and is expressed in experiences that people have in trauma, feeling they're going to disappear or they lose a sense of being present. It's involved in people feeling threatened by medical illness sometimes, or in experiences like shutdown, like the feeling like, I don't know what I'm feeling. I'm frozen in my body. I can't feel my body.
Disassociated, zoned out.
Right. And so that really is dealt with, and Porges has given us a language to talk about this by using the new networks that our mammalian brain developed that are rooted in the brainstem, but actually are specifically set up to assess the social environment around us, the sounds of people's voices, the expressions on people's faces, the way they're moving, and to recognize the friendly voices and faces and movement that, and to be able to have the self-regulation to calm the reptilian brain so it doesn't get freaked out and go from one extreme to the other, fight or flight or faint and freeze. And that down-regulation is what embodied practices are designed to do. And there's basically two kinds of embodied practices. There's top-down practices that's using imagery and recitation, and there's bottom-up practices using breath work, intensive breath work, and posture. And both of these work actually on different branches of the vagal nerve, and that's the calming part of our autonomic nervous system, to calm the stress reactivity in the brainstem, the primal part of our nervous system, and to enhance the sense of safety and openness to connection, both connecting with our internal environment, our visceral feelings, our inner well-being system, and also connecting with our ability to really be deeply open, intimate, deeply caring toward others. So, these ancient traditions have tools that help us reverse the damage of stress and trauma at all levels of the nervous system and enhance our integrative capacity to be calm enough, secure enough, and open and engaged enough to really be able to bring the tools of love, the power tools of love and care into our lives.
Into our lives for ourselves and for others. And I'd like to just, say, since you are a clinician, is that for a lot of people, I think that there's this underlying sense, and I think I mentioned this to you before when we were talking, perhaps over at Jewel Heart or something like that, but it was that, a lot of folks think that there's something wrong with me. there's something wrong with me. I'm a bad person. There's something wrong with me. I do it wrong. And there's this sort of attachment, and I say attachment meaning that there is a correlation between the fact that they can't quite have figured out how to act skillfully for sustainable happiness in their lives, with somehow that they're bad, they're guilty, they're in a shame state. And that oftentimes with mindfulness and with this basic sort of, even Dan Siegel would talk about it in terms of scientific and quantum, stuff with the plane of possibility and mathematical terms, but that there's this other grounding of, well, you're not just your programming or your conditioning. So you think there's something wrong with you because there may be some unskillful actions that keep going on repeat, the repetition compulsion thing or whatever it is, that maybe continue to make you unhappy, but that you yourself aren't the bad person or whatever. And so when you learn to sort of pull away through these practices and through this foundational understanding and separate out that which is sort of swirling around, I say sort of the rings of Saturn, and then you're keeping yourself grounded as the planet of Saturn, you can have that relationship with what you're doing or what's happened to you, and not just be in the re-triggered trauma time, limbic emotional reliving of the memory state all the time. Right. And the practices help shift that. But that foundationally, people don't have to think necessarily that like, it's my fault or I'm not unusual.
Well, we don't have to, but we do. And the reason is because this is where, our evolutionary conditioning, our survival bias and our negativity bias, they tend to default preset our nervous system and our mind to lean into the negative. And, Rick Hansen talks about our brains are Velcro for suffering and Teflon for happiness. And there is a 5 to 10, in some studies, 100-fold bias toward holding on to, emphasizing, and weighing the negative. And as part of that, even this worst case sense of myself. I'm so small and vulnerable and powerless. I maybe made mommy annoyed, so I'm maybe not a good person. So all of this guilty, shame-based, fear-based experience that we have, our consciousness without awareness gravitates toward that and tends to over-identify, and we get stuck to it. And this is what makes trauma or even sort of interpersonal difficulty or lack of skill, as you described, that makes it feel so personal. And so part of the contemplative traditions, I believe, from way back, was to really have the wisdom to know that in order to rebalance that and to help us let go of that worst case sense of self and world, we really need to exercise the positivity part of our nervous system and of our consciousness to strengthen those muscles so that we can let go, we can be more Teflon to the negative and more kind of Velcro to the happiness part. And that's where I think a more positive understanding of psychology, psychotherapy, really not looking at the illness so much, but looking at the potential for healing, even in trauma, and even in terms of social problems and cultural problems like racism or sexism or whatever, understanding that we human beings have this amazing capacity, that we are much bigger than our stress, our trauma, our prejudice, our childhood trauma, whatever reactivity. But the rub is that unless we make that effort to let go of the stuff and build the strength it takes to lean into the positive, we will default to that. And that's where the stubbornness, and that's where the importance of training the mind.
You're freezing up just a little bit. And we can't hear you. And you're sort of freezing up a little bit.
The sort of disciplines of contemplative practice are so important. Okay. Oh. It's having so many people. Okay. Nandi, can you be in the other room, sweetheart? Am I back?
I see you, but you're not quite synced.
Okay.
And now it looks like you're still a little slow. Still a little frozen. Yeah, I'm not hearing you. If you want to get back on, sure, go ahead, and I can just talk for a second, and feel free to bounce off and bounce back and rejoin the call.
Yeah.
It might be helpful. But in the meantime,
Okay.
I'll just...
Okay.
You're
I'll
still frozen.
Right.
Yeah, you're still frozen. And you're still on the call, so I think maybe you can jump off and then jump back. So what I'm going to just say in the meantime is that I think a lot of people who do, in fact, feel as though there's something wrong with them or feel as though there's a problem, when they do come back, there you are.
Yeah, so you got my point that we need to practice in order to strengthen our ability to let go of the negative.
Joe, I can't see you. You're too close.
Sorry.
Thanks. Yep, perfect. Yeah, so people need to elect to engage in this. And one of the things that I think is really important about what you've mentioned before in terms of what Tibetan practices kind of emphasize, and I think any of the mindfulness sort of lineages, if you will, talk about the fact that when you have, and even in psychotherapy, you know when you have a therapist that you feel really loves and cares about you. We talked about positive neuroplasticity and Rick Hansen. He talks about your caring committee. Dr. Diane Poole-Heller talks about your transformation tribe. Somehow having someone, your benefactor, your therapist, your doctor, your mindfulness teacher, your Tibetan transmission person, whoever it is, be the person who is embodying some level of nervous system regulation, care, love, and compassion for you, so that you can begin to feel as though that's something that you can have and grow within yourself for yourself, and then eventually extend that out to others instead of just locked into the contraction.
Yeah, it is important to have it modeled, but it's also important to have people educate you and train you to do it, because you have to feel that it's possible. Usually that's by encountering another person, but you also have to know that it's possible. And you also have to know that you can do that, how to do it. And so that's something that psychotherapy isn't as good at. And even maybe traditional spiritual communities are not so good at. That really, it takes both sides. It takes the world reaching out to you with safety and connection, and you learning how to take that in and how to act on it. So I'm sorry, but I probably need to run now.
Yep.
Francesca.
No, I understand.
I think we've covered a lot of territory.
Definitely.
And you know, I'm so grateful that you were persistent and we found the time. And it's great what you're doing. I'm really a big believer in getting this stuff out in as many ways as possible. So
well, and thank you. Well, thank you, Joe, for not only your time, but all of the time that you spend on Nalanda and offering these teachings, because I do want to let people know, and I will post the link to the website, that they can join the mailing list. They can be updated, that you not only offer courses here in New York, and I believe there's a parallel on the West Coast, but that you also have some offerings online that you're beginning to expand out. And there's also the efforts that I know your partner in crime, Jerry's doing with the Radical Compassion Project, that is working to upend systemic racism as well. So there's a lot of different ways in which people can get involved and educated, and anybody who wants any further information can certainly contact you off of that website. So Joe, for all of your efforts, many thanks. I appreciate it.
And same to you. I'm so happy to hear your new project here is going so well, and you found a way to reach out to more and more people, and it's so important. Thanks, Francesca. Take care.
Process. Take care. Bye now.
Okay. Bye-bye.